Let's turn our gaze once again to the Northern Theater. In 1776, America actually suffered a number of setbacks. You'll recall that Washington had sent an army that had been guarding New York City north into Canada. The idea was that the Canadians would see the American army as liberators, and many of them would join the American side. In fact, that thinking proved incorrect. As the Americans sieged Quebec, they found that the British people in Quebec were no longer sympathetic to the American cause, and in fact were deeply inconvenienced by the siege. Many of the Quebecan British who had been somewhat neutral actually turned against the Americans. Although Congress would continually try to get Canada to join, they never would. Now that left New York City vulnerable, and after Boston, Washington turned to New York City. He and the British were thinking the same thing. New England was simply too difficult to conquer. There were so many patriots, and the militia was so numerous and so willing to fight that it would be better to target another area of the United States. George III began raising a magnificent army in 1775, and by the summer of 1776, the British sent 32,000 soldiers under General William Howe to America. They originally landed in Nova Scotia, organized, and then began their war on New York City. General Howe's intention was pretty clear: capture New York City and take advantage of many of the Loyalist forces there, and then he would be within striking distance of Philadelphia and Congress. He hoped to end the war in 1776. Now, at this time in the American Revolution, wars were dictated to some extent by weather. And in fact, in this area of the United States, the winters caused war to be very difficult indeed. Not only was the weather too cold for men to march, but often the roads were made out of dirt, and so they would be a mixture of thawing and freezing, and it was very difficult to move things. So war tended to take place between the months of about May to about December. Bypassing New England, Howe landed his troops, all 32,000, on Staten Island on July 3rd, the day before the Declaration of Independence. His leadership immediately met with Washington, who was also in New York City, and offered pardons. So this was the third peace offering. Washington refused, and so the battle commenced. Howe invaded New York City in August, defeating Washington's force. Washington had about 10,000 men. Howe had 32,000. Washington had to pull back, and then he was somewhat trapped between the river and also Howe's forces. Howe paused for a moment at that time to meet with Congress. On September 11th, 1776, Congress sent John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Edward Rutledge to meet with Howe and discuss peace, a fourth attempt. The congressmen indicated that the only way forward was for Howe to acknowledge the recent Declaration of Independence. Howe simply didn't have the authority to do that. So in a quick meeting that lasted only 3 hours, neither side was able to agree, and the war commenced. Washington, understanding that the overwhelming numbers meant he had to withdraw, made a very interesting decision. Under cover of fog and night, he abandoned New York City. This was probably the right decision. He probably would not have been able to withstand Howe's forces, and his army was the only army left. Now, generals are sometimes criticized in history. People are good at various things. Some generals are fantastic at training their troops. Washington was not necessarily good at that. He hired other people to do that for him. Some generals are very good at understanding a battlefield and moving their people so that they inflict the most damage. He was serviceable in this way, also not one of the best. What he was fantastic at, however, is what we call logistics. Logistics is the ability to move people and equipment when you need them in the most efficient manner possible. And he was also fantastic at taking advantage of the cover of night. Now remember, 1776, there were no flashlights, there were no street lamps. Everything was done by torch or by lantern. Somehow, Washington, under the cover of fog and night, manages to move 9,000 troops outside of New York City across a river. And the British had no idea. And in fact, Washington was the last person to leave. Not only did he not lose a single person, he lost no equipment. That's the logistical brilliance of George Washington. That wasn't the first time he had acted at night. Recall that in the siege in Boston, Howe wakes up in the morning and finds cannon surrounding all of Boston. They hadn't been there the night before. This wouldn't be the last time. After he fled New York City, the British took control of New York City and the harbor, and it would become their main headquarters throughout the entire war. The Americans would never be able to regain New York City, although they tried a couple times. Further, the harbor was such a great harbor at New York City that the British fleet was able to stay repaired and also provisioned very easily from that location. The British were able to raise Loyalist militias and even turned some of the patriots in New York to the Loyalist side. Loyalist sentiment was at an all-time high. Meanwhile, patriot morale was at an all-time low, and the Continental Army dropped in large numbers over the winter of 1776. There was one more move, however, that Washington had up his sleeve. You recall, I said he was a master of logistics and nighttime attacks. On Christmas night, December 25th, 1776, Washington famously crossed the Delaware River. Somehow he managed to get 2,400 men on boats and under the cover of darkness sneak and attack a British outpost, capturing everybody and also all of their equipment. He stayed harassing the British until a week later Cornwallis arrived to try and capture Washington. And then again, under cover of night, he snuck back across. Essentially, he managed to avoid direct confrontation that would have cost the war. And yet he still managed to strike and cause damage. Meanwhile, France watched all of this very, very closely. So there were a number of setbacks for the Americans in late 1776. We lost New York City. It became a stronghold for the British for the rest of the war. And British morale was at its highest in 1776, while Patriot morale was at its lowest. But the British intention to end the war in 1776 was misplaced. There was a lot of war left.